everyone. Welcome to today's lecture as part of the Sustainability Council's lecture series. I'm Akanksha Yola and I use she/her pronouns, and I work at the Sustainability Council at the University of Alberta. Today we will hear from Dr. Greg King, and I would like to start today's lecture with the treaty acknowledgement. The University of Alberta respectfully acknowledges that we are located in Amiskwaci-Waskahigan, which is situated on Treaty 6 territory. This land is the ancestral space to the Papas Cheese Creek and the Métis Nation and the traditional territory of Niitsitapi, Dene, Stoney Nakoda, Anishinaabe, and many other indigenous peoples whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. As a settler, I continue to reflect on what it means to live, work, and play on Treaty 6 territory, and I'm committed to growing my knowledge and understanding of these important histories and how I can honor the gifts of these lands. The Sustainability Council works with all faculties at our university to spark learning, discovery, and citizenship for sustainability. We offer courses and experiential learning opportunities for students, support sustainability-related research, put on sustainability awareness events just like these ones, and engage with the broader community on sustainability initiatives. The lecture series is a bi-weekly event which highlights sustainability research, teaching, and innovation over a range of topics with the goal of generating conversation on sustainability across disciplines. We are hosting a diverse group of speakers, both from the University of Alberta and beyond, to cover a number of topical issues related to sustainability and sustainable development. Upcoming lecture topics include an oil-resistant story and building equity in climate practice. To find out more information about the Sustainability Council's events and opportunities, please feel free to browse our website and sign up for our newsletter. We are really excited to have Dr. Greg King present today. Dr. Greg King is an assistant professor of environmental science at the University of Alberta Augustana campus. His journey to studying dendrochronology has included living and working across Canada. Born in Victoria, BC, he grew up in Cold Harbour, Nova Scotia. His bachelor and master's degrees are from Carleton University. His bachelor was in environmental science and master's in physical geography, and focused on studying and investigating paleoecology and forest disturbance ecology in Yukon and Northwest Territories. He then pursued a PhD in climate science and a lot of chocolate at the University of Bern in Switzerland, investigating tree growth dynamics in stunning alpine Swiss valleys. Upon returning to Canada, he taught at Mount Allison University in Sackville, and in 2015 joined the Department of Geography and Planning at Queen's University as the Robert Gilbert Postdoctoral Fellow and called Kingston, Ontario home. In 2018, he made Camrose his new home and established the Augustana Tree Ring Lab, which investigates tree response to environmental drivers, focusing on both natural and human-mediated ecosystems. Let's help in welcoming Dr. Greg King, and we'll also be holding a Q&A session after Dr. King's presentation. So please put your questions. Just raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll take it from there. Yeah, let's welcome Dr. Greg King.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So I'm both at the U of A and beyond because I live in Camrose at the Augustana campus. So it's an undergraduate campus down in Camrose, and so I drove up this morning. And so thank you very much for coming. Yeah, the sustainability lecture series, I was invited to partake as I won a Sustainability Leadership Award, but I think my leadership award was less for the research and more for the teaching and service that I do at Augustana. But I was encouraged to talk about my research that I do, and so I wanted to integrate this, but I wanted to also challenge any teachers in the room that there's ways in which your research on sustainability can play a major role in the classroom, and it's really important that it does. And so I'll think about a couple of those things as we go here. So I am a dendrochronologist, a tree ring scientist. That's my background. And trees act as a really interesting environmental proxy. Basically, that there's an explicit link between how wood forms and how a tree grows and time. And that was kind of first noticed back in Greek philosophy days, which is why dendrochronology is a Greek word. So dendron meaning tree and chronos meaning time. So it combines those two. But the first kind of really prominent observations were by a really small-time artist you may have heard of, Leonardo da Vinci, that in between time painting some great pieces of art, he also had enough time to kind of note that the rings around the branches of trees that have been sawn show the number of its years. And I think we'd be familiar with that. If you've seen a tree that's been cut down or removed, or a branch been cut off, you can see these concentric or concentric-ish rings. And each of those can tell a story about the tree's age, the time, and also other things as well. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of dendrochronology and then introduce you to two case studies where we're applying this both in the urban landscape and then in more of a natural landscape as well, although human impacts as well. So this would be kind of what you'd be familiar with in terms of what a tree cross-section, or in the lingo we call it a tree cookie, looks like, where you have these alternating light and dark bands. And the light parts of this wood represent spring or early season growth. So the cells are really big. It's in the spring, the tree's growing a lot, and they have very thin cell walls. And the dark band represents late season growth. So together, one of those annual rings actually represents a light part and a dark part put together. And so yes, you can count these rings and kind of figure out the age of this tree and how long it's been alive. An age of a branch, an age of a root even is very similar. But there's more you can do with these rings than just count them to get an age. You can also look at the signals that are contained within them. And so this quote, "The trees composing the forest rejoice and lament with its successes and failures and carry year by year something of its story in their annual rings." This is a quote by Andrew Ellicott Douglas, who's viewed as kind of the father of dendrochronology, based in Arizona. And basically, it's kind of a poetic indication that this information of a good year and a bad year is retained in the rings, and it's there forever until we can access it. And to understand and speak the language of trees, we can learn more about its background. Now, on campus here, I was walking around a little bit this morning. I had some meetings in the forestry and RENAR faculties. There's some really good examples of giant trees. There's a big Douglas fir over in the forestry atrium, and you might be familiar with these cookies. We don't have to cut down a tree and kill it to get the tree ring story. What we usually can do is actually a non-destructive methodology called coring. And basically, it just uses a basic hand drill, quite simple. It's like a hollow core that takes a piece of the tree out about the size of a drinking straw. And in almost all cases, the tree will seal that wound, similar to like a branch falling off or being damaged or anything like that. And so we can actually get these ring histories without having to cut down the tree. This is a picture from the Scottish Highlands, looking at kind of records of pine growth in old plantations as well. And this is what the core looks like when it comes out of the tree, and I'll talk a little bit more about the process that we have in one of our case studies, but that's about the size of it, and that's kind of the amount of wood that you can pull out, and you can kind of already see some of the rings that are there. Once you prepare the surface of the cores, this is kind of what it can look like under a microscope, and that's basically the tools we use to look at these rings. Here again, you can see that lighter area is the early season growth, and so this tree is growing from the bottom left out to the top right. That's the direction of growth. And what you can see is there's differences in the widths of all these different rings. And what's really important is to understand the environment you're collecting these samples in. So for example, we need to know what's limiting the tree growth. So that large ring in the middle, if we were coring trees in Arizona, that actually might be indicative of a wet year, because it's kind of always warm. We kind of know that about Arizona, but when you get a wet year, then you have a lot of precipitation and possibility for a tree to grow more. However, if we're coring trees in the Yukon or further north, where I've done some of my research, that same large ring, a different tree of course, would indicate more of a warm year, that these trees would be temperature limited more than precipitation limited. So we have to have some idea about the growth environment to really get and understand the signals. It's really important that trees are not thermometers. They're not rain gauges. They can't tell you exactly how much rain. It's more of a relative comparison to other years, and to understand that there's also lots of other factors that go into this: genetics, competition, disturbance, and things like that. Now, really importantly, we might be limited in many cases to the length or the ages of trees, and sometimes in certain locations those ages are not long. We know and hear stories of several thousand-year-old trees in some places in the Rockies. The redwoods of California are several thousand years old. The bristlecone pines of the White Mountains of California are 4,000-year-old trees, and they're still living. And so you have this really long record. But in many places, we run into the problem that trees are not old enough. But what you can do is cross-date. And this is like the really important part of tree dendrochronology analysis, is that we want to overlap those patterns. So you can see these colored bars on the right-hand side of the screen. Basically, you can see that's a living tree, and then you have a certain record that goes back, and then you find maybe an old cabin or something that uses downed wood or dead wood on the ground, and then you can overlap those patterns and extend them backwards into time. It's also really important because we don't want to take one tree and say this is the story of the forest from a single tree, that we need to collect samples from multiple trees, make sure that they're kind of synchronized or telling the same story, to look at those patterns, and then we can get a better story of the overall. So my first case study looks at urban forests, and in advance of this lecture I was taking a moment. One framework for sustainability and thinking about sustainability is the Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 of them. I encourage everyone to take a look at them. And I was thinking about where this research could play into these Sustainable Development Goals, and I think it really touches upon several, probably mostly sustainable cities and communities, and also thinking about life on land, but I think it touches on these other ones as well. And so this case study is looking at how we select trees for our cities, what trees we select to plant, and how those trees are responding to a changing climate, especially when it comes to increased heat stress and drought. So this research took place within Edmonton's urban forest, which you probably are all familiar with. But some people would say, well, what do you mean an urban forest? This doesn't make sense, does not compute. But basically an urban forest is all of the trees that partake or are included in an urban area. So not just the river valley with its amazing kind of relatively natural tree stands, but also the trees that we plant on campus, the trees that we plant along our streets, the trees that we plant in our community parks. Those are all included as well. And this is an air view of an Edmonton neighborhood, and you can see from the air, sometimes on the ground you don't get an appreciation for how green our city is, but from the air you can really see that this canopy extends over streets, over houses, and that has benefits and risks to it. So why are urban forests important? There's a number of reasons, and I think that it kind of touches upon all three pillars of sustainability. The social impacts are well known and are growing in terms of health impacts, mental health, well-being. We knew during COVID that when we had opportunities to be outside and in these park spaces, they became really important and really valuable. But having that connection to green space is really important for mental well-being. Studies have also linked things like maternal health and better pregnancy outcomes to being greener neighborhoods. And all of these kind of important considerations around, is it the trees that are providing the benefit, or is it simply that having trees in a neighborhood makes it more walkable and more inviting to be in? We also were able to see that in this study when we went out and cored trees in Edmonton, that as soon as you kind of start measuring trees on people's boulevards, public trees, people have lots of stories. They want to know what you're doing, which is good for them, and it was awesome. There was great conversation with them around kind of people who planted trees and went from there. Economic benefits are actually quite high. There's been many studies that have shown that investment in trees returns benefits both in ecosystem services, but also directly into home value, property value, which then trickles down into things that can help tax assessments and things like that. And I think the environmental benefits is probably the most common viewpoint that I approach my research from. Trees help reduce air pollution, mitigate urban heat islands, which is kind of the focus of this research here, improve water filtration, slow down stormwater, and provide wildlife habitats and preserve biodiversity as well. So really, when we're thinking about solutions to climate change and sustainability challenges, trees are always a good one that can touch upon many aspects of it. However, it's really important that the trees actually survive to maturity. It's great that we want to plant lots of new trees because we need new trees. But if those new trees cannot survive to maturity, then those benefits are limited. Benefits really accrue exponentially, and it's related to the canopy of the tree, so all of its leaves and the shade that it provides. Basically, as that canopy grows, the benefits increase. And so if we don't figure out ways to get trees all the way through to maturity, then we actually increase our costs to keep taking out trees and keep planting new ones, but also we don't see the benefits accruing over time. And this kind of speaks to this research. Is we know that climate change is warming cities, the urban heat island, so trees play a role in mitigating that, but that heat is also impacting our trees. So what's the response of trees to drought? And that's only one of the possible challenges that urban trees face. There's also other challenges like a lack of diversity in our cities. So less of an issue in Edmonton, which is quite unique, is that we still have a huge population of American elms. Basically everywhere else in the continent has been removed due to Dutch elm disease. We still have a huge population of green ash, emerald ash borer being an invasive insect that's impacted millions and billions of trees on the East Coast. But we have an overrepresentation of certain species in our city, and so that lack of diversity can also be a risk. We also have urban stress. We know that soil compaction, soil issues, building issues, conflicts with infrastructure. We want to put new density. We want to build, increase density and build new housing, but that happens in mature neighborhoods where we have lots of tree cover. So there's a balancing act that has to be taken there. And then I talked about the future changes in climate. So our research question on this research was that as temperature and drought frequency, intensity, and length are predicted to increase, how are 4 common urban tree species in Edmonton, and that would be the green ash, the bur oak, Siberian elm, and white spruce, responding to that growing environment? And the way that we look at that is through their rings. So what we were doing with this research was looking at if trees, broadly, how do trees respond in the city, but we differentiated by looking at trees that are located along streets, so basically in those boulevards, in those medians, to look at tree response there, versus trees that are in parks. So we didn't look at the larger parks, like the river valley or things like that. We tried to look at smaller community parks that would have been designed and planted rather than natural forests as a comparison. And we looked and we traveled around the city. We had a selection from Edmonton. The city of Edmonton has a great tree inventory. They kind of know where all their public trees are, and we were able to use that as a first filter. And then we went to visit these trees, and we had to make sure that trees, had similar conditions to each other. So similar soil compaction. Were they big enough? Did they have a big enough DBH? Usually there's not a problem coring trees, but if trees are tiny, you don't really want to core them. We want to give them the best chance to reach that maturity. And we also focused on the core of Edmonton, so not going out to some of the further suburbs. And in-field decision making, we had to look and see, what is the overall health of these trees. Sometimes the inventory is a little bit out of date, and so we had to go and see, was the tree still there? Is there large things like scars, damage in the canopy and things like that, because we want to stay away from that because that can actually influence how the tree grows, of course. And so this is a map of our tree selection with the colored dots kind of showing where we sampled trees. We did about 20 plus trees per species in both parks and streets to kind of look at their ring growth. And data collection, this is a picture of Lorraine Paris, who was doing she was an undergraduate researcher on this project and did an amazing job on collecting trees, doing all the processing and the analysis afterwards. But this is what we did. We walked around to different neighborhoods. We knew what trees we were looking for. They are all numbered in Edmonton, whether there's not a number on the tree itself, but we can find them all. And then we would use our increment borers to collect our samples and bring them back to the lab for processing. And what we were looking at was really the impact of drought. So drought is made up of two different things. It's both warm temperatures, but also low precipitation. And one way you can incorporate those things is in what we would call an index. And this is one example of an index where it combines those things. And this is a record from 1950 onwards for Edmonton. And it's called the SPEI, or Standardized Precipitation Evapotranspiration Index. And the basic thing is that when you fall below 0, you're in a situation of drought. What we have circled on the screen here is ones that are in red. Those represent significant droughts, especially in the recent about 20 years. So we know that 2002 was an incredibly dry year, but it was actually kind of really unique in the last 50 years as being one of the strongest droughts. And we've actually seen more recurring droughts recently than even in the last 50 years as well. So we're interested in looking at how the trees are responding to those signals. When you line these up, so at the top we have our ring width index from all the trees. So this is every species grouped together. We're not even differentiating between the green ash and the elm and things like that. And we draw these black vertical lines down. And on the bottom, the bar graph represents that SPEI curve from before in the droughts. And the black lines we've chosen here are drought events that are below an SPEI of -1, so a relatively significant drought in terms of the record. But also Loren went into the record to look at newspaper articles and see if the drought was mentioned in Edmonton, if there was kind of a social awareness of that drought. So watering restrictions or grass being kind of really brown that year or things like that, so that it was a noticeable drought. And what you can see is that every kind of line, most of them end up showing that there's a lower amount of growth on the tree. And I don't know if my cursor shows up. Oh, it does show up there. So there's a decline in tree ring growth in most of the cases, especially in the 2000s, where you see there's growth high and it drops down for a drought period, a drought period, a drought period, and a drought period. So you can see this, this decline in growth and then a response. And what we wanted to do, though, was look to see like how significant is this as a factor that dominates the growth of trees, because there's lots of other things going on in the city. And what we can show here is that it does play a significant role, that there's a really good connection between SPEI and the different species. So we have each species up here. Green ash is Fraxinus pennsylvanica, and you can see that as we have more drought on the left-hand side, those negative numbers on the x-axis, we actually see a declining amount of growth, and as you have less drought, then you have more growth. So it makes sense, but what we really want to see is the interesting difference between park and street. And what you'll notice on the top is that the park trees actually seem to grow a little bit better than trees that are on the street. There's more of a negative response to trees on the street. And what that means is that the drought, we would think of street trees as being the most stressed in our urban environments. They're like surrounded oftentimes by concrete. They don't have as much soil volume. You know, if you built roads and sidewalks next to them. But what we see is that those trees are actually less prone to drought sensitivity than park trees. And some of the reasons for that is potentially that, you know, there's not much green space in those areas. And so when you have rain that's falling, it's actually all being funneled into a small little volume of soil. And trees, the research has shown in the past that the literature indicates that, you know, trees in those areas actually it's kind of like overwatering your houseplants. You put too much water on them, they have more of a response to having too much water than too little water. And during the droughts, it actually seems to mitigate that drought response. There's actually lower levels of competition in these street trees than in some places in parks, because you don't have turf grass and all these things around it. And so this means that impermeable surfaces are somewhat working to their advantage. Now, the limitation here is that we're only looking at mature trees. So we don't know the history of when you plant a new tree in these environments, are they able to reach that mature stage where they can really have those benefits? And I think that's the next step, really, in this research. One other thing we wanted to look at was not just on a given year, a single drought, but what happens afterwards. And so there's two things we can look at. There's a resistance index and a resiliency index. A resistance index is kind of saying, okay, there's a drought and trees maybe don't respond to it, or they have enough reserves built up that they're not impacted super negatively. And so what we look at there is the amount of growth in the drought year versus the amount of growth 5 years before the drought to see how much does it drop off. The resilience index is all about post-drought versus pre-drought. So how fast can a tree that has a drought response return back to its normal growth? That's kind of looking at, over time. And when we look at this and we look at it kind of by species and we put it together, we have on the bottom there on the x-axis all of the different drought years, so 58, 67, 85, 2002, 2009, 2015, and 2018. We can see that our resilience, there seems to be a little bit of a downward trend, but in terms of statistical comparisons, it didn't really kind of come up as being something different. And there was no species-specific differences as well. But the resistance is really interesting. It did show a decline over time. And so what we're seeing is that as your numbers fall below that 1, it means there's less and less resilience. And so every subsequent drought is having more of an impact, and the return of growth is not really happening because in some ways we're having droughts so frequently that these trees are stressed more and more and could have negative consequences for many species of tree in our city, and we lose those mature trees, then we don't have replacements for them, and that's the fear. Now the sampling was actually conducted as part of a national effort led by the University of Quebec Montréal, and basically we're looking at a similar sampling strategy or the same sampling strategy across the country, so Edmonton, Winnipeg, Montreal, Quebec City, Halifax. They've now done Hamilton and Ottawa as well, and the same species. It's really interesting that the same species can be found in urban centers across the country, and so we want to look and see how are the responses similar or dissimilar across the country. And so we're really happy to be able to contribute to this overall project and this idea. And so that's kind of the completion of my first case study, and I'd really like to thank Lorraine from the Augustana Tree Ring Lab, Maggie, Kaisa, and Alain Paquette from the UQAM, and then the City of Edmonton Urban Forestry Division. The City of Edmonton is awesome. They have a great urban forestry division. I think they go under the radar, but they were very, very helpful and supportive of this work. My second case study deals with the Beaver Hills biosphere. This is moving outside of the city now and going back to kind of our natural forests and thinking about kind of some of the ideas and the SDGs that are linked to this work. It really is about water and water on surface water, thinking about climate action, thinking about life in that water and life on the land. And we had a territorial acknowledgement at the start, but as you might know, Amiskwaciy-Wahigan is Edmonton, and it's Beaver Hills House. But Amiskwaciy refers to the Beaver Hills, which is just east of Edmonton, and it's really this traditional gathering place. And I think it's really important to acknowledge this because I think there's a role for this traditional ecological knowledge in this story that I'll tell, and we're continuing to build those relationships with groups from that area. And so this work is all about the UNESCO Beaver Hills Biosphere. It's located just east of Edmonton, and we're focusing this kind of story on Cooking Lake. And Cooking Lake is one of the largest lakes. It's right in the middle of the biosphere. Some of you might have known it. It's a pretty shallow lake. This project is a little bit more focused on the European settlement history of the area, and I'll talk about why that is in a second. But like I said, we want to tie it in and think about some of these older stories and think about these records that these trees can hold. So, Cooking Lake, vacation destination, not kind of comes first to mind maybe now, but when we didn't have the ability to fly all over the place, people were looking for a way to get outside of Edmonton, and one of the best places to go was the white sandy beaches of Cooking Lake, extensive fishing, lots of yacht clubs, and it was a resort location for well-off citizens of Edmonton. Joseph Turrell surveyed this area in 1887 and reported white sand beaches and really healthy fisheries. I don't know if anyone's been to Cooking Lake recently, but it doesn't look like that anymore. And so it's a question about kind of what has changed, how does that fit into a longer term context? Basically, the biggest thing that's happened is that lake levels have dropped about 9 feet or 3 meters since the early 1900s. And that decline in lake levels has been really significant, especially in the last, in the 1970s, it was noticed that the lake levels were declining, and there was big studies done there, but not much has been able to change on that trajectory. Maybe it held for a little bit, but now it's kind of fallen off. And there's a real chance that Cooking Lake and some of the other those lake systems are potentially drying up, that there will be no water left anymore. And it was really interesting, though, because we don't have any records back earlier than the early 1920s. A couple of spot records, one measurement a year. There's a big break. There's consistent records from like 1958 onwards, and then automatic records from the 1970s. But we don't know, what were the lake levels before this? Had it dried out before? Had it not dried out before? Was it always increasing? And what we had the opportunity to do here is look at, is there a story that the tree rings can tell us about this? And this came up because a community member said that there's some history hiding in plain sight, and that we had an opportunity to kind of incorporate tree rings into the human history of the area and also think about the environmental history. And so that picture was of what we call the Spruce Lodge. Sheriff Walter Scott Robertson built this cabin for his family in the late 1800s. But you would not know that this is one of the oldest standing structures in Strathcona County. It's on private land. It's not a historic site or anything like this. And so a community member had asked about this and been thinking about, could we use the log construction of this cabin to reconstruct kind of lake levels before we were recording things with instruments. And it's an opportunity to really link this environmental history together. And so given the wooden construction, we went to look at this cabin with the homeowner and with the community members, and I kind of said, yeah, we can do this, without really knowing if we could do it. It's kind of the academic way, is to jump in. But we had a clear tree species. Thankfully, they called it Spruce Lodge. So they gave us some indication that it was potentially white spruce, and we were able to confirm that because the bark was still on it. And the cabin was in great shape. The wood and structure was in great shape, and so we were able to core these logs and kind of extend this history of the area. And this is what we call dendroarchaeology. So dendroarchaeology is tree ring work that's using historic buildings or historic wooden materials. So these are non-living trees. They've been collected and harvested, but all of that information in their rings, if you can still collect tree ring samples, is still retained. And basically, it can provide this empirical analysis. For historic structures, it really helps to kind of solidify when buildings were built, when art pieces were created, several other things. But they also have information about environmental history. And so what we would do is normal sample collection would be kind of with an increment borer, but increment borers are meant for living trees. They're softer. They haven't been sitting around for 100 years. And so we had to bring a little bit more firepower, and we had to use kind of a hand drill, like a hollow hand drill bit to kind of bore into the tree, a little bit of bigger sample. And basically, we collected about 36 to 38 cores from the Spruce Lodge, and then also a number of other cabins within the Beaver Hills. And we were looking at kind of what is this record of the rings. And the sample preparation I alluded to earlier, this is kind of what one of these samples when it comes out of the cabin looks like. If you kind of squint your eyes, you can kind of see rings, but this is where the sample preparation is really important, and basically it's progressive sanding and polishing of these samples. So this turns into something like this, where you can really very clearly see to the eye even all of the rings, and then when you're looking at it under the microscope, you can see to the cellular level. And so this is called the spaghetti plot. And what this is basically every line represents one timber from that lodge, or that cabin that we sampled. And we wanted to know, is there a common signal? Because a cabin could be created from timbers and wood collected from all over the Beaver Hills. It could be pulled from the mountains for all we know, right? And timber brought in. So we needed to know, is there a common signal? And when you line all of them up together based on kind of the end dates and just going from 0 to 100 and starting, we don't really know the dates of these, you can see that there's really some points where they agree very, very strongly, and there is a common signal. There's a lot of variability around that signal, but you can see that they're moving kind of in conjunction with each other. So that common clear signal is really important. There's an intercorrelation value of over 0.58, which is quite good. And although we could then internally cross-date, we could say, okay, this tree lines up with this tree, and we had stories about when the cabin was built. There was no firm record of when that cabin was built. And the problem then becomes, how do you anchor this chronology? How do you know what years it represents? And that's where we had to find some living trees that would extend back to the time of that cabin to be able to anchor it in. Now, the first attempt at this was, some of you might be familiar with St. Albert, and there's the Grey Nuns Forest. It's a quite old spruce forest, and there's been a dendrochronologist who worked there and developed a chronology of those trees. And we compared it, and there was no match whatsoever. So it was really interesting. So it indicated, A, that the wood didn't come from St. Albert, and B, that we were still left with not knowing how do we figure out what the strong dates of this series are. And so we had to find some older trees. And what we did, and coming back to the lake impacts, is that there were stories that there was fires. There was large fires in the Cooking Lake area in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and so there were no old trees left. Everything had burned. But what we did was we went to visit some islands. Now, this is a picture of Coney Island. You might be wondering, where's the roller coaster? But it's not that Coney Island. It's actually another Coney Island. And you might also be looking at it and wondering, why is that an island? There's no water on it. Well, in the 1960s, there was water on it, and it was separated from the mainland. And so what happened when fires burned in the late 1800s is the fires never reached these islands. And so this island, you can kind of see in the center of it, has an open area where there was some construction, but also a very old open-grown spruce forest that still remain today. And so we were able to visit this island, and again, this is all private land. So we were able to interact with the community, spread the word of our research, and they were invited to kind of find old trees in different places. And so we went and we cored trees there, and that they were old enough between that island and a couple of other islands that we visited that are no longer islands, you can walk to them, to be able to extend that record backwards. And so what we end up with is a living chronology. So we know exactly those dates because we know when we cored them, the trees were alive. And then we can have this about 50 years of overlap. And I think this comes up. Oh, there's about 50 years of overlap here with these historic timbers. And so we can anchor them in kind of very strongly to say this is kind of strongly, we know what date that this cabin was built. And then we can now extend this chronology backwards. And so once you put it together, you can see that there is a common signal, that they do agree, which means two things. It means that the trees come from local forests. They were collected locally and built locally. And also then that we can use this entire record to reconstruct the environmental history of the region. So the first thing I wanted to talk about in the human history part of this is dating the Spruce Lodge. So what this is these are all the timbers that came from that cabin. And what we have here is kind of indicating the last complete ring. And about 17 of the timbers have a last complete ring of 1896. So that represents about 60%. But when you also then look at the number of timbers that are completely intact on the outside edge. So we know we haven't lost any rings. We haven't lost the bark or missed any years. We end up going to about 90% of the timbers that have complete records are from 1896. And so what this suggests is that the cabin, those trees were felled in 1896, and the cabin was constructed in 1897 or 1898, depending on if you let the log sit for a year, which is what we assume, then 1898 is the construction date of this cabin. And you can actually go seasonally. So if you look at, these are two examples, and if you look in this zoomed in area, you can actually see where the last ring was, and you can see that there's a little bit of early wood and just the ever so slightest amount of late wood starting, so that darker period of the ring, which means that these trees were probably cut in August of 1896 or late July of 1896, and so you can zoom in on that seasonal idea and say that this is when they were sampled and this is the date of this structure. Then we can go to the chronology. And the chronology is, here's what we have so far. We thought that we would have pretty good replication through time. There were some of the logs in this structure went back to the early 1700s. And so extending this chronology back that far is really, really cool, before any Europeans had visited Alberta at all, and to go back that far. What we do have is kind of a limitation in terms of sample depth. So we need to core any cabins. So this is my call out. If you know any relatives who live in the area and have old cabins or old things that you've seen on the side of the road, you can let me know. But we can go back to about the early 1800s with really kind of a good replication and to understand that those signals are quite reliable. And so from there, we look at how that chronology and that collection of trees responds to different environmental variables. And what this shows is looking at precipitation. The lakes in the region are fed mostly by spring precipitation and snowmelt. And so what we're looking at here is precipitation at different times of the year. And what jumps out as being really significant is current year May and June precipitation. There's some previous year signals as well, but we see that this is pretty strong. So that precipitation in May and June corresponds to ring width positively. So if there's more precipitation, a wider ring. And if there's more precipitation, then the lake levels would presumably be higher as well. So we can use a proxy to reconstruct and understand how those lake levels have changed. And this is still a little bit early on the reconstruction of this, but if we go back in time, we can kind of see that our current levels of the lakes are quite a bit lower, smoothing at different resolutions, thinking about 10 years and 25 years and 50 years smoothing, so just kind of to smooth out that signal. But we still see that the current lake levels and current drought levels in the early 2000s were quite unique in terms of the system. But we did have drought before. We did have periods in the late 1800s, mid 1800s, 1860s, 1870s that seemed to be low precipitation for a decade or so. And so likely the lake was low at that time. So what's the story here? Is the environmental signal the only one, or is there human impacts also on these lakes in terms of water withdrawals and things like that has changed? And that's kind of where we're going with this research next. So overall, my takeaway points from this lecture and this opportunity to discuss my research. Trees are what I would call sentinels of time. They're there, they can't move as far as I know, so they have to weather the environment that's around them, and they have a record of that environment. They can be chronicles of both the environment in terms of the climate, but also things like fires and things like this, but also how we use the forest, which is really interesting. So if you have old trees that are cut down in cabins, it can give you an idea of what kind of trees were cut, where were they cut, and things like this. It's a relatively simple tool with tremendous applications. Sorry, I couldn't resist the pun. Across environments and disciplines. So one of the really challenging and rewarding parts of especially the Cooking Lake Biosphere, but also the Urban Forest Project, is that it's interdisciplinary research. It impacts kind of planning and management. It impacts things like local histories and environmental history and social history of areas. And so that interdisciplinary research means that you have to speak languages that sometimes you're not used to as an academic, but it's been really fulfilling and rewarding for me to try to expand into those different areas. And I think that the outcomes from this can directly inform sustainable development pathways. I think that by understanding how our trees are responding to drought, we can then inform, and we already have started sharing our results with the city of Edmonton to understand which kind of species they should be planting and prioritizing for future in terms of response to drought. We have opportunities to think about how do these long-term lake levels fit into our discussion of what lakes in the Beaver Hills biosphere look like today and tomorrow and in the future. If you're interested, I'll leave this slide up. Many of the stills from the Beaver Hills biosphere section were taken from films that were put together by Dylan Reed, and there's a whole collection of them that the Beaver Hills has put up. They're quite fantastic. And if you want to learn more about the history of the Beaver Hills, I'd really recommend to go there and take a look. And this research as well was supported by undergraduate students from the University of Alberta Augustana campus, especially Kelly Heineman and Chelsea Cook. And so I'd like to thank that. And at that time, I'm all done, and I'd welcome questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kim, for such a wonderful presentation. We're moving on to the Q&A section now. Do you have any questions to start with?
I'm interested in your observation that boulevard trees seem to be less susceptible to drought than park trees. And I don't buy your explanation, so I want to propose a different,
Okay.
which is that they're exploiting leaky sewers and pipes as opposed to collecting surface water. Because the evidence is that there's much more runoff from a paved, roofed surface
Mm-hmm.
that goes down through the sewers
Mm-hmm.
than goes through the soil. And so I wonder if you would explore that explanation.
I have not. I think it is a quite valid explanation as well. That it's not just surface water that's funneling into these places, but is also, we know from anecdotal information from people who have to get their sewer pipes cleaned out all the time, that the roots move to where the water is. And as soon as there's cracks in infrastructure, and frankly, many of the neighborhoods that we were coring in is central Edmonton. These are older neighborhoods, more likely to have kind of cracks in their infrastructure. So that is very much a possibility. It's interesting because when you reconstruct some of these streets, they're replacing the infrastructure. And that's something that we could possibly check on, is when was the infrastructure replaced? So like pipes and things like that. And then we could go back and look, because we have this annual year-by-year record, did that happen just before a drought? And what was the response for a drought pre and post kind of reconstruction? Something might be looking into. I know that some researchers have looked at the influence of sidewalk construction, but I haven't seen anything about the influence specifically of pipes and leaking, and maybe that's because the cities don't want you to look into how many pipes are leaking. But that's not recorded, right? Okay, good. Exactly, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, in the 1950s, there's a lot of paper and tar pipes in the older neighborhoods, because that's what was going from my house out to the main line, and
Mm-hmm.
it got replaced 5 years ago.
Right. And
So, yeah, which they actually can start to collapse a little bit after a while, but I would think that it would be fairly easy for the trees to dig into those.
access that as a water resource. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I think that's a great comment.
What about people watering their lawns? I don't know doing that, right?
And so what we tried to select, sometimes without success, we ran into some people who really cared for some bur oak trees that they had planted actually in the front there. City trees now are on public property, but they had planted them and cared for them, was to try to find trees that weren't necessarily watered by homeowners, that were kind of, maybe in the median, in the middle of the street, or something out front that didn't have a connection to it. But it's always a consideration, is how much did the homeowners, even in a drought year, because sometimes we've seen the city have really valid communications around that and saying we should go out and water our street trees to give them a drink during and so, we still see that as being a potential possibility, but no one's maybe going to the parks is kind of the converse thing. Yep. They do water some boulevard trees, yes. And so the question is, I don't think they've been watering since 2002. That's a kind of a relatively new program. And so it's kind of which droughts and when was that watering going on. Yeah.
Does drought resistance and drought resilience change with the age of the tree?
In this case study, I'm not sure. It's something to think about. In natural forests, yes, we see that in forests that there's sometimes more of a resilience to older trees that have built up a carbon store that can kind of return afterwards, and resilience. Resistance, I'm not sure. There's a lot of research in forests and in dendrochronology because of the annual records to look at that. In Europe, there was some large heat waves in France where there was a lot of stuff going on, and they showed that resilience and resistance was decreasing for everything and leading to more widespread mortality. But in terms of the ages of those trees, generally speaking, dendrochronology looks at older trees, not younger trees. So I don't know if I have enough data to answer that fully.
Human activity, fertilizing, herbicides, pesticides on lawns, the draining onto trees, or in my case, I don't have a boulevard, but I planted trees all over the place. Don't use any of that stuff, but it can come from neighbors. How's
Yep.
that going to impact you?
I mean, it's the same as a kind of any vegetative growth, that it would spur the growth if there was kind of fertilizers that was accessible by the organism. It's possible with dendrochronology to do chemical analysis of individual rings to look at chemical signals. They've done that for air pollution in cities and locations where you have kind of lead. I've not seen arsenic from mines and things like that, and looking at that. So the impact would probably just be more growth. In terms of pesticides, I'm not really sure. Larger organisms maybe are less impacted, but I'm not sure about if there's anyone who's looked at that within the tree rings themselves.
Your comment of pollution brings up a point. I grew up south of the city in Ellerslie, and for many years, we would drive into the city to go shopping once a month, and you could smell that your lungs and nose would burn from the pollution at that point in time. Now it's, I have to leave the city to drive in and enter this brown haze. Did you notice, or did you look for any of those impacts on the older trees?
We didn't, and it's something that we just kind of had to kind of assume was kind of generally impacted everything. But it is something that can be looked at, is there a record of this? We know that air pollution has kind of relatively decreased over time from those early areas, and especially downtown Edmonton has changed from an industrial kind of makeup into something else. And so is there a record of that in some of the trees? It could be. The trees in the cities are generally speaking younger than trees outside. However, we were coring and finding 80, 90-year-old green ash and American elms and things like that. So those were planted at a time when it possibly could record that in the ring. So it's something that's possible, a future endeavor.
So are you going to work with some of that Indigenous communities in Beaver Hills to look at the history pre-settler? Because I would think that they would have stories.
That's the goal. The Beaver Hills biosphere is working to reconnect individuals to the land in the Beaver Hills. There's been a lot of kind of separation of those two for various reasons and removals and things like that. But the Métis Nation is engaging a lot more with the Beaver Hills biosphere, and Bob Montgomery with the biosphere is doing a really great job to bring back education around that and bring back opportunities and build those relationships. And what I'd like to see is be able to kind of contribute this as one way of knowing and another way of knowing, and to see how well those kind of exist with each other. And I don't think any one is less valid than the other, but I think it's a more complete and nuanced story with both of those. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So it is a goal to have that. I think it's making sure that that's not an extractive process and saying, oh, can you just tell me your stories just so I can write about this kind of thing, and making sure it's a relationship. Exactly, yeah. And so it's growing in the Beaver Hills, which is nice to see. It is like a UNESCO biosphere that many people kind of don't know. It's right on our kind of doorstep. And so is that an opportunity then to push forward some of those relationships?
Unrelated to your talk, but perhaps of interest. In Islet Lake, which is from in the Beaver Hills area, there is a small buried or submerged forest.
Right.
Would you have any comments or interest in these things?
I think absolutely, because, you know, when I point to this record from the Beaver Hills and I say we can go back to, you know, 1750 or 1718 is the oldest ring that we have, kind of thing. And I think that's great for central Alberta. But if you go to the Rocky Mountains, it's easy to kind of be like, oh, there's 1,000 years here and 800 years here. So opportunities to extend the record through structures or through things that are submerged wood, especially if it's in an oxygen-free environment, can still be as good as it is kind of the day it was submerged. And so it'd be really interesting to do that. I know I have some colleagues in Scotland that they go around some of the old bogs with a snorkel, and they pull out the wood, and you can saw it like it's fresh wood. And from that, you can kind of go back in time. So I would be very interested, and I will speak with you after the talk to kind of talk about that.
Similar emerging wood in parts of Saskatchewan.
Okay.
In the Moose Hills or somewhere southeast of Regina.
Okay. Yeah, but I think it's fascinating to think that that means that at some point the water levels were low enough that a forest established. It was long enough a period that the trees could grow into a forest, or a stand of trees at least, and then the water level rose enough to kill them. And so, yeah. There's fluctuations there, and to know those fluctuations is important. Yeah, yeah. It's really about putting a long-term context on it. That's kind of the goal of dendro, pre-instrumental. So, yeah, there are measurements out there. They're just not the measurements we're used to.
Thank you so much for all of your wonderful questions in this discussion period. Unfortunately, we will have to end the Q&A here. I wanted to take the opportunity to thank Dr. King for being with us here today and for putting up this wonderful presentation. Next time I'm in the park or going on a hike, I will not appreciate the beauty and the stories that trees tell. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you.
The Sustainability Council has a small token of appreciation.
Oh. Thank you very much. Yeah, so pleasure. Thank you very much, everyone.